Anyway, my name's Stephen Davies. I'm a 2016 Nuffield Scholar, and my study topic is the Australian seafood industry and the social licence to operate. I wish to sincerely acknowledge the FRDC for my sponsorship, Nuffield Australia and the team, and my contractors, Maritarum Limited, Glasshouse Advisory, Aquatic Life Industries and Marine Produce Australia. And I wish to also extend a special thank you to my wife, Gabrielle, and my daughter, Octavia, who arrived partway through my scholarship and accompanied me on some of my travel. Who am I? I'm a third-generation passionate seafood professional, originally hailing from Jonas's neck of the woods in Port Lincoln. I fished for 17 years there, primarily for prawns, but also had heavy involvement in the aquaculture industry. I met a girl, Gabrielle, and chased her across to Western Australia. And I relocated there a few years ago, where I launched a consultancy business providing advice back to industry. Living in Port Lincoln, growing up in Port Lincoln, it's a bit of a bubble where seafood producers are held on something of a pedestal. As I travelled the world over the last couple of decades, I realised that in modern times I was increasingly having to defend myself and my industry and its people. I believe it's a seminal time for our industry. There's concerted efforts underway at the moment which are aimed at undermining industry and its ongoing social licence to operate. And my travel took me to 9 countries, including developing nations and developed nations, to understand more around the concept of the social licence to operate. Snapshot of my industry. The Australian seafood industry is vitally important to the social and economic fabric of our nation. We consume around 350,000 tonnes of seafood annually, of which around 70% is imported. It's an industry under increasing levels of attack, and in fact I sometimes like to say that there's more fear-mongering than fish-mongering going on in the modern marketplace. These attacks are generally unfounded and not representative of the sustainable way in which we operate. It's vital as an industry that we work proactively to change perceptions. We've all seen these types of figures before and it's easy to glaze over, but I want you to actually look at them with fresh eyes. We're looking at a global population of 9.5 billion by 2050, a rapidly emerging global middle class of 5 billion, 66% of which will reside in Asia. And this presents unprecedented global challenges, but also unprecedented global opportunity. And I think Australia is very well positioned to take advantage and capitalise on that for a range of reasons. Social licence to operate, what is it and why is it important? There are unwritten, intangible social contracts which legitimise businesses and organisations. Social licence requires any business to ensure its activities respect the rights of each and every stakeholder, and an organisation or project which holds the current and ongoing approval of social acceptance of its stakeholders is said to hold the social licence to operate. And if you lose it, you lose your business outright. What does the Australian seafood industry rely on? I believe 2 fundamental things: healthy, abundant and well-managed natural resources, which we've got in absolute spades, and maintenance of access to what is essentially a public resource, which is fish. And that is where we have some ongoing challenges. In the modern market, there's extra public scrutiny around businesses these days, and for the most part I think it's welcome. And if you think about the Royal Commission into the banks, it's exposing certain behaviour which is not consistent with the brand. So I think it is to be welcomed in lots of cases, so long as it's founded by real information and true information. Patagonia, on the other hand, is a great example of a business which has recognised that everybody's looking over your back fence these days, and have capitalised on that to create one of the world's most trusted brands. As I said before, as primary producers, it's important we work to influence perceptions around our industry, but it's also important that we listen to what our stakeholders are saying to us and adapt and evolve. Perceptions around sustainability. My industry has some image problems, and if you take the cohort of Australian women, just 33% of Australian women believe that the fishing industry is sustainable. And it's a bit of a kick in the guts when for a producer, when you're labelling or marketing your seafood as wild, and in doing that you're actually alienating 67% of your target market. So we need to change the way we do things potentially, and obviously work to educate the public. The reality around sustainability: I'm a fisherman, or at least I was for a long time, and I'm a catastrophic rapist and pillager of the sea, aren't I? 2013 to 2017 ABARES fishery status report state there were no fish stocks classified as subject to overfishing in Commonwealth fisheries managed by solely by the Australian government. And this points to 50 odd years of profoundly successful co-management of our natural aquatic environment. And these statistics are independent of industry. What happens if you lose your social licence to operate? One of the most interesting places I visited was Puget Sound in Washington State. Cook Aquaculture purchased Icicle Seafoods a couple of years ago for $74 million. Icicle had been operating in Washington State producing Atlantic salmon for 35 years. And Cook probably could have been excused for thinking it was business as usual. They had a fish escape around the end of last year, which was not without historical precedent. And this was grabbed hold of by a particularly effective NGO, turned it into a political football. It ultimately was voted upon by legislative parliament in the state of Washington, and they ultimately voted to ban the farming of Atlantic salmon in Washington state beyond 2022. So it points to how easily things can change. The modern market's not business as usual. There's increased scrutiny, the rise of online activists undermining your business, increased competition for resources, fragmentation of industry preyed upon by NGOs, consumer apathy preyed upon by social influences, and as I mentioned before, there's the crowdfunding of licences out of existence. How are we portrayed? This is how I like to portray us. That guy there on the left is my grandfather. He's a salty old, he's now sadly passed, but he's a salty old sea dog flying the sea to provide you with sustainable seafood. On the right we have the other extreme, which is, if you can read the bottom there, you will learn how overfishing will end life on Earth. And it's very easy to take that approach where you look to denigrate another industry, and because we've got a lot of farmers in the room, I'm going to do it right now. What fishing represents to me, and I'm going to point to flaws perhaps, there's no land clearing, there's no planting of monocrops, there's no use of chemical pesticides or herbicides, no draining of artesian basins, no runoff, just the sustainable harvest of a renewable resource perpetuity. And if we've got any bankers in the room, we don't charge fees for no service to dead people either. But, you know, of course we shouldn't use that kind of rhetoric. We're all on the same side here. But this leads to consumer confusion about where they might go to find a guilt-free purchase in the modern market. When I was in Seattle, I took these photos 50 metres and 5 minutes apart, but here at Pike Street Markets we see wild sockeye salmon. It's genuine, it's caught by fishermen and fisherwomen, ticking all of the boxes. And if you just go 80 metres up the street, there was a Anonymous for the Voiceless activist campaign showing images, quite confronting images of my industry. And I think these are about as representative of my general industry as showing an image of Martin Bryant might be, you know, when you're portraying Australian men. It's extreme and it's not helpful. And that obviously results in consumers losing trust. Then they turn essentially to third-party certifiers. Now, if you can make sense of any of those, and that's only a small portion of what's available, it gets horribly confusing. And travelling the world and meeting with lots of these third-party certifiers, I learnt pretty quickly that they're pretty quick to denigrate each other as well. So again, it leads to another level of confusion. There's no doubt in my mind that there's a place for these third-party certification groups. However, we do need to remember as industry that they are only as strong as their weakest link. And when we jump into these international third-party certifications, is that really what you want to do? Because as producers, you are looking for ways all the time to differentiate your product. And do you want the same tick, or do I want the same tick as a barramundi producer in Thailand or wherever? So I think there is a place, and that place is probably to create some non-replicable Australian third-party certifications. There's lots of social licence considerations for my industry, and I'm not going to bore you with them, but as a business, whether you're in the seafood industry or not, I hope you go away today and work to identify your stakeholders and understand their desired outcomes, and then work internally to address these desires proactively. Challenges to obtaining the social licence. The most commonly encountered problems include the company fails to adequately identify its stakeholders, and there are lots, trust me. Stakeholder groups launch unprovoked and unfounded attacks on your business, a lack of engagement by businesses with stakeholders. The company portrays something, it says something, but it doesn't actually back it up with real life stuff. And industry is fragmented and delivers a mixed message, and Jonah's pointed to that before. The fragmentation between aquaculture and commercial fishing is a classic one. Aquaculture guys say we are the answer to, you know, the fishermen who are overfishing the world, and the wild harvest guys. We're the answer to these aquaculture guys that are feeding your fish antibiotics and whatever else. And it's not particularly smart, because when you're importing 70% of your seafood, there's a pretty clear issue of commonality there that you can band together and work together. There's a few levels of social licence, from kind of not having it to the top one, and we'll just focus quickly on the top one. Advocacy is where you want to get to with your business, and that's reaching a point where you have such a strong level of community ownership and buy-in that they will literally chain themselves to your oyster infrastructure if anybody wants to take it away. Maintenance of the social licence. I saw lots of examples around the world. I'm going to just focus quickly on engagement. I met with lots of people in industry who said the same thing. They didn't know that we existed, and now they want to see us gone. And you know, that points to a pretty clear problem with regard to lack of engagement. People have to know you exist. They have to know what you do. Just a quick one on social media. If you look at the combined Instagram followers for FRDC, Seafood Industry Australia, and WA Fishing Industry Council, we get 1,997. If you look at a single respected ocean activist, Paul Nicklin, he's got 4.4 million followers. That's just one guy. So do you work against these guys, or do you actually work to find ways to work with them? Because at the end of the day, we've got the same outcomes and the same desired outcomes, which is healthy, abundant oceans. Is maintaining a social licence good for business? Well, losing it certainly is bad for business. And if we look at one example, you know, just recently in manual exports in Western Australia, losing your social licence is akin to losing your commercial licence. But there's a rapidly increasing pool of ethical investors. ESG funds, tracked by Bloomberg, rose 37% in 2017 to 445 billion. And the good news is, if you lose your social licence, you can win it back. This is Giuseppe Panisi. He's the last of the brown trawl fishing operators working out of the port of San Francisco. His business was going backwards, and he either had to hang up his hooks or reinvent himself, and he did that. There was a 20-year moratorium on the ban of sale of fish from the back of boats in San Francisco. He worked over 2 years to overturn that ban, and had some unlikely allies in the port of San Francisco. And ultimately, yes, overturned that. In the first weekend, he sold 350 pounds of fish from the back deck of his boat. The next weekend was 500 pounds, but he got the local Chinese television station down there. They filmed it, they put it on Facebook, and the next weekend he sold 10,000 pounds. And it's a fantastic opportunity, a fantastic example of a business that adopted and evolved, but also a great example of a port recognising the importance of guys like Giuseppe with regard to the overall experiential tourism industry. The Port of San Francisco has the Fisherman's Wharf. It attracts 14 million people a year. Up until Giuseppe started selling fish earlier this year, you were pretty hard pressed to meet a fisherman at the Fisherman's Wharf. It's just crazy. Some animals are more equal than others. Probably the most interesting place I visited while I was away was the port of Taiji in Japan. And I wanted to research balancing historical practices against modern market expectations, and I came away realising that sometimes you can't. And the Taijians have kind of enjoyed an almost symbiotic relationship with the whale for centuries, and I can't tell you how important the whale is to that town. It's as important as any animal is to any peoples I've ever visited on Earth. But as whaling became less economical, they took to the annual slaughter of dolphins to generate income for the town. And as part of that, they also take some of the baby dolphins and sell them to dolphinariums and aquariums around the world. And that's clearly unacceptable behaviour in anybody's language, and it points to, we need to listen to people. That's an extreme version, but we do need to listen to people and adapt and evolve. Conclusion, I think my study raises important questions for any industry wishing to operate in a modern market. It's not business as usual. We must work proactively to ask questions of consumers and NGOs alike. And those questions essentially orbit, do you have a problem with what I do? If you do have a problem, what is it? And now let's work together to address those problems before they become public problems that take you by ambush. My recommendations, there's a few there. But yeah, the Australian seafood industry works to better identify key indicators which impact on its social licence. Industry understands the importance of social licence as a fundamental business consideration. We take proactive, positive and consistent messaging delivered in chorus to the stakeholders. Access to wharfs and fishers is encouraged and maintained wherever possible, and Australian consumers are provided with country of origin labelling to the plate in Australia, which currently doesn't exist. And as consumers, I ask you to talk to members of the Australian seafood industry, talk to people like me, understand what I do, and then help us to ensure we retain community support to continue supplying you with sustainable, high-quality Australian seafood. And as industry, I think we need to just do one thing, and that's listen. And above all, I want you to walk away from here today and never ever criticise a fisherman or a farmer with your mouth full of food. Thank you.